She's just here to mop floors. Don't let her near the execs." The words, sharp and sterile as the lemon-scented disinfectant in her bucket, cut through the hushed tension of the hallway. Mark Thorne, senior manager of operations at the Grand Meridian Hotel, didn't even look at Imani Williams as he spoke. His focus was entirely on the trembling junior staffer, Chloe, whose name badge was clipped on ever so slightly crooked. Thorne's command was an afterthought, a piece of human lint being brushed from the lapel of a $1,000 suit. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't stop her methodical, practiced rhythm, dipped the mop, wring it out with a soft, hydraulic sigh, and glided across the Italian marble in a perfect, overlapping figure eight. Her movements were a form of meditation, a physical language she had mastered over 2 years of working nights and early mornings in the silent, opulent corridors of the hotel. To the world, she was a function, a tool for maintaining the illusion of effortless perfection that the Grand Meridian sold for $5,000 a night. The hallway leading to the celestial ballroom was a cathedral of wealth. Sunlight, filtered through 30-foot-tall arched windows, illuminated dust motes dancing like tiny diamonds in the air. Crystal sconces dripped light onto walls adorned with abstract art that cost more than her entire life's earnings. Her job was to erase any evidence of human passage, a scuff mark, a stray footprint, a smudge of oil from a careless hand. She was the guardian of the void, the priestess of pristine surfaces, and in this temple she was an untouchable. Not in the way the art was, revered and protected, but in the way a live wire was, to be avoided, ignored, and certainly not engaged. Her grip tightened on the worn wooden handle of the mop just for a second. The pressure was the only outward sign that she had heard. Thorne continued his barrage of instructions to Chloe, his voice a low, urgent hum. The meeting in the celestial ballroom was, as he'd repeated in 3 separate staff briefings, a hotel-defining event, a multi-billion-dollar joint venture between the hotel's parent company, Atlas Hospitality Group, and a burgeoning Chinese tech conglomerate, Xingli Innovations. Everything had to be flawless. Imani watched their reflections in the floor she had just polished. Thorne, a man whose ambition was so sharp it seemed to give his silhouette a razor's edge. Chloe, a young woman so desperate to please she looked like she might vibrate into pieces. And herself, a ghost in a gray uniform, her form blurred by the very perfection of her work. Would you endure this? The question surfaced in her mind, not with anger but with a quiet, academic curiosity. To be so present, yet so completely erased. She had learned that invisibility was a kind of currency. When you are no longer a person to be seen, you are no longer a person to be guarded against. In the past 2 years, she had absorbed more confidential information than the hotel's entire security staff. She knew which executive's marriage was failing based on his late-night calls in the lobby, which board member had a gambling problem from the frantic whispers to his bookie, and which deals were truly solid versus the ones built on bluster and hope. She was a silent archivist of the secrets of the powerful. The elevator chimed, a gentle, melodic tone that announced the arrival of gods. The doors slid open and Alastair Finch, CEO of Atlas Hospitality, strode out. He was a man who didn't walk through a room but conquered it, his voice booming as he clapped a colleague on the back. "Let's get this done. I want their signature on the dotted line before lunch." They swept past Imani without a glance. She pressed herself back against the wall, her cart a shield, making herself smaller, flatter. One of the executives, distracted by his phone, nearly collided with her mop bucket. He sidestepped at the last second, muttering an exasperated Jesus, as if the bucket had materialized out of thin air with the express purpose of inconveniencing him. A moment later, the elevator chimed again. This time, the energy was different. Mr. Chen, the chairman of Xingli Innovations, emerged with his delegation. They were quieter, their movements more economical. Their power wasn't loud, it was a gravitational force bending the space around them. Mr. Chen's eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the hallway, taking in every detail, the height of the ceilings, the quality of the art, the flawless gleam of the floor. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, his gaze met Imani's. It wasn't the vacant, dismissive stare she was used to. He saw her. He registered her presence, cataloged her, and then moved on. The acknowledgement, as brief as it was more startling than Thorne's insult. Thorne practically bowed as he welcomed the Chinese delegation. "Mr. Chen, An honor to have you. We are ready for you in the ballroom." The heavy, soundproof doors of the celestial ballroom swung open, revealing a long, polished table set with pitchers of ice water, notepads, and pens that probably cost more than her weekly grocery bill. The two sides filed in, a river of dark suits and quiet ambition. The doors clicked shut, and the hallway was silent again. The muffled murmur of conversation from within was the only sound. Imani was alone with the echo of Thorne's words, just here to mop floors. She looked down at the marble, at the distorted reflection of the woman in the gray uniform. For a moment the illusion held, that's all she was, a set of hands, a function, a ghost. Then she took a deep breath, the scent of lemon and ammonia filling her lungs. She dipped her mop back into the bucket. Ring. Glide. The figure 8 pattern continued, erasing the last traces of the executive's arrival, restoring the hallway to its state of impossible, inhuman perfection. Her work was her silent answer. "You can erase me," it seemed to say, "but you cannot erase what I do, and what I do is flawless." An hour crawled by. The murmur from behind the ballroom doors rose and fell. Imani continued her silent patrol, her world contained to the long, empty corridor. Her tasks were finite, repetitive: empty the ornate trash receptacles, polish the brass door handles until they shone like solid gold, check the restrooms for any sign of disorder. Each task was a small anchor, keeping her tethered to the reality of her role. It was during her pass by the service station, a discreet alcove where coffee and water were replenished, that the next small indignity occurred. A catering manager, a man with a perpetually pinched face, was barking at Chloe. "The coffee is lukewarm. You know who is in that room. Get it right, or you'll be serving lukewarm coffee at a diner in Queens tomorrow." Chloe, flustered, fumbled with a heavy silver urn. As she turned, she bumped squarely into Imani, sloshing a bit of hot water onto the floor. "Watch where you're going." Chloe snapped, her fear and frustration finding the nearest, safest target. She didn't apologize. She didn't even seem to register that Imani was a person. She was just an obstacle, a part of the scenery that had failed to get out of the way. Imani said nothing. She simply retrieved a dry cloth from her cart and knelt, wiping the small puddle from the marble. As she knelt, her own ID badge swung forward on its lanyard. It was a simple, starkly functional object: Imani Williams, janitorial staff. A low-resolution photo of her, taken on her first day, stared out with a neutral expression. The plastic was slightly scuffed, the edges worn smooth. This small rectangle was the sum of her identity here. It was the pass that allowed her into these halls, and the sign that commanded she remain invisible within them. It was a license and a leash all in one. As she rose, her gaze fell upon a side table near the ballroom entrance. A junior associate from the Atlas Group had carelessly left a leather-bound folder there. It was open. Inside, a stack of documents lay waiting. The top page was the English version of the contract, dense with legal jargon. But beneath it was the Mandarin version. Her heart gave a slight, traitorous flutter. She knew she shouldn't look. Her role was to clean around such objects, to pretend they didn't exist, but the elegant, complex characters called to her. They were a language she understood not just colloquially, but academically. It felt like seeing a piece of home in a foreign land. Her eyes, trained by years of study, instinctively scanned the columns of text. She wasn't snooping. She was reading. It was as natural to her as breathing. It was in that brief, stolen glance that she saw it again, the symbol for indemnity paired with the character for retroactive. It was an odd, almost nonsensical pairing in this context, like seeing the words flammable and water used to describe the same object. An error. A significant one. She pulled her gaze away, her movements calm and deliberate as she pushed her cart past the table. But the image of the characters was burned into her mind. The air in the hallway suddenly felt colder, thinner. The polished marble beneath her feet seemed less solid. She had seen a crack in the foundation of this billion-dollar day. A crack no one else seemed to notice. She continued to polish a brass handle, her reflection staring back. A silent woman in a gray uniform, now carrying a secret that felt heavier than her entire cart. Later, during a designated break in the negotiations, the ballroom doors swung open, and the executives spilled out into the hallway, their voices a cacophony of forced pleasantries and veiled frustrations. Amani was tasked with clearing the small side room where the translators and assistants had been working. It was a mess of discarded paper cups, pastry crumbs, and crumpled notes. While replacing the liner in a waste bin, her fingers brushed against a sheaf of papers, a printed draft of the contract, marked up with red ink. It was clearly an earlier version, now deemed trash. Normally, she would have simply bundled it up and been done with it. But curiosity, a dangerous and unfamiliar impulse in this place, made her pause. She flattened the pages inside the bin, her back to the door, and scanned the text. There it was again. Clause 14b. In English, it was standard legalese. The undersigned parties agree to an indemnity clause protecting Atlas Hospitality Group from any future liabilities arising from operational failures post-acquisition. Standard. Forward-looking. Safe. Then the Mandarin translation directly below it, her breath caught in her throat. The translator had used the term Su Yuan Pei Chong, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. A direct translation might be tracing to the source compensation. It was a highly specific and, in this context, highly volatile term. It didn't mean future liabilities. It meant the opposite. It meant Atlas was agreeing to be liable for problems that could be traced back to their source, regardless of when they occurred. She felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. It wasn't just a bad translation. It was a nuclear bomb hidden in a footnote. Xingli Innovations owned dozens of older properties, many of them joint ventures with other companies. This clause, as written in Mandarin, would essentially make Atlas Hospitality the retroactive insurer for any pre-existing structural, legal, or financial problems in Xingli's entire portfolio, as long as they were discovered after the deal was signed. It could be a liability of hundreds of millions, perhaps more. It was corporate suicide, gift wrapped in a linguistic mistake. How could they miss this, she wondered. Did they hire a first-year student? Was their lead translator so arrogant he didn't double-check? The red markings on the page were all over the financial figures, the timelines, the staffing requirements. But Clause 14b was clean, untouched, overlooked. The weight of the knowledge was immense. It was no longer an academic observation, it was a ticking clock. The document in her hands was proof that the deal about to be signed was a catastrophe. She quickly folded the discarded draft and slipped it into the deep pocket of her apron. It felt like a block of ice against her hip. An accusation. A responsibility. What do you do when you're the only person who sees the iceberg, but you're the one everyone has been ordered to ignore? This was a no-way-back moment. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unknow it. And soon she would have to do something about it. The stakes had just been raised from a corporate blunder to a potential implosion, and she was standing at ground zero. The break ended, and the executives filed back into the ballroom. A new wave of tension followed them. A call had come through. The lead interpreter, a man named Jeffrey Vale, had been in a minor car accident. He was fine, but he wouldn't be arriving for at least another 2 hours. Panic began to ripple through the Atlas staff. Mark Thorne's face was pale, his voice tight as he spoke into his lapel mic. "Get me a list from every translation service in the city. I need a Tier 1 Mandarin legal specialist here 30 minutes ago." The meeting, however, couldn't just stop. They tried to proceed with a junior translator from the Xingli side, but he was young, nervous, and lacked the specific legal vocabulary. The conversation became stilted, then stalled completely. The atmosphere grew thick with frustration. Amani was clearing the coffee station when the chaos peaked. The coffee machine, a complex new model from Switzerland, chose that exact moment to malfunction, flashing an error message in German. Chloe, already on the verge of a breakdown, stared at it helplessly. Thorne barked, "Just fix it." Amani stepped forward. She didn't speak. She simply unplugged the machine, removed the water basin, and pressed a sequence of buttons on the side panel, a hard reset she'd learned from reading the manual during her own quiet lunch break weeks ago. She reassembled it, plugged it back in, and the machine hummed back to life, its friendly blue light blinking. It was a small, logistical fix, a moment of order restored in a sea of chaos, but it was done with an unnerving competence. Just then, one of the older Xingli delegates, a man who looked more like a university professor than a businessman, walked out of the ballroom looking flustered. He needed the restroom but had gotten turned around in the grand, confusing hallway. He approached Thorne and asked a question in rapid, formal Mandarin. Thorne just stared, helpless. Chloe, find someone. Before Chloe could even stammer a reply, Imani turned to the delegate. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, she said, her voice quiet but clear. The restroom is that way, sir. To the left at the end of the hall. Her accent was perfect, not the hesitant, textbook Mandarin of a Western student, but the crisp, tonal precision of a native speaker. The delegate's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in the gray uniform and the mop cart. He nodded, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, he said, thank you. Then he walked off in the direction she'd indicated. Thorne spun around, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. What was that? He needed the restroom, Imani said simply, her expression unreadable. I know that. Where did you learn to speak like that? You pick things up, she replied, the phrase a deliberate echo of his earlier dismissal of her. He stared at her for a long moment, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He didn't see competence, he saw a complication, an anomaly that didn't fit into his neatly ordered world. Right, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Well, stick to your actual job. He turned his back on her, the small moment of her brilliance immediately undermined, dismissed as a parlor trick. But the ripple had been sent. Chloe had seen it, and more importantly, the delegate had seen it. The ghost in the hallway had a voice. The weight of Thorne's dismissal settled back over Imani, a familiar cloak of invisibility. But something had shifted. Chloe was now looking at her differently, with a mixture of awe and confusion. The junior staffer, who had been a bundle of raw nerves all morning, seemed to see Imani for the first time not as part of the hotel's machinery, but as a potential lifeline. The failed coffee machine and the delayed interpreter had put Chloe directly in the line of fire. Thorne was using her as a scapegoat, hissing critiques and impossible demands every few minutes. During another brief pause in the proceedings, Imani found her in a small supply closet, her back to the door, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The closet was cramped, smelling of starched linen and industrial-strength air freshener. Imani didn't say anything at first. She simply reached for a box of tissues from a high shelf and offered one to Chloe. Chloe jumped, startled, and hastily wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, you shouldn't be in here. It's a supply closet, Imani said, her voice gentle. We are both allowed to be in here. He's going to fire me, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. I can't do anything right. The interpreter, the coffee, everything. Imani looked at the young woman, who couldn't be more than 22. She saw the same raw fear and desperation she'd seen in the eyes of countless interns and assistants chewed up by the corporate world. They were bright, ambitious, and utterly unprepared for the casual cruelty of men like Thorne. His anger is not a measure of your competence, Imani said quietly. It is a measure of his fear. He is afraid of Mr. Finch. Mr. Finch is afraid of losing this deal, and all of them are afraid of looking weak in front of Mr. Chen. The anger flows downhill. You are just standing at the bottom. It was a stunningly precise and empathetic analysis, delivered with the calm authority of a seasoned psychologist. Chloe stared at her, her tears momentarily forgotten. How do you? I watch, Imani said. She took a clean, folded hand towel from a stack and ran it under cool water in the small service sink. She wrung it out and handed it to Chloe. Hold this to your eyes for a minute. It will help with the redness. The simple, practical act of care was more powerful than any platitude. It was a gesture of solidarity in a place where everyone was ruthlessly out for themselves. Chloe took the towel, her hand trembling slightly as it brushed against Imani's. In that moment, a fragile, unspoken bond was forged between the invisible janitor and the overwhelmed assistant. Imani had offered her a moment of grace, a quiet acknowledgement of her humanity. This small act of kindness would soon have consequences neither of them could predict. It had given Chloe a reason to trust her, and that trust would become the key that unlocked the entire third act. Imani took her own 15-minute break in the stark, windowless staff cafeteria in the hotel's basement. The air was thick with the smell of fried food and bleach. She sat alone at a small formica table, the folded, discarded contract draft resting in her lap. She didn't need to look at it. The words were seared into her memory. She closed her eyes and let the legal machinery in her mind whir to life. It had been years since she'd formally practiced, since she'd sat in lecture halls at Georgetown discussing torts and international contract law. But the knowledge was still there, a dormant muscle now twitching back to life. She mentally diagrammed the trap of Clause 14b. It was, she realized, a trap of cultural and legal assumptions. Alastair Finch and his team saw the contract through a Western lens. Indemnity was a shield against the future. They were protecting themselves from what might happen after they took control of the new joint assets. They were worried about a pipe bursting next year, a lawsuit filed next month. But the term used in the Mandarin text, Su Yuan Pei Chang, was rooted in a different philosophy. It wasn't about the future. It was about the source. It implied a holistic responsibility for the integrity of an asset. If you buy a house with a cracked foundation, you are buying the crack. The responsibility traces back to the origin of the flaw. She pictured the conversation in the Shingley Innovations boardroom after the deal was signed. Mr. Chen, a brilliant and meticulous man, would never have allowed such an error to go unnoticed if it disadvantaged him. So did he know? Was this a deliberate trap? No, she decided. That wasn't his style. He was a man of honor. More likely, his legal team saw the error, understood the monumental advantage it conferred, and chose to remain silent. It wasn't cheating. It was simply accepting the terms your opponent had written themselves. The financial implications were staggering. Shingley had recently acquired a portfolio of resort properties in Southeast Asia. Several were known to have significant structural issues and were tangled in local zoning disputes. With this clause, Atlas wouldn't just be buying into a new venture. They'd be handed the bill for a decade of neglect and mismanagement in properties they had never even seen. It was a poison pill, wrapped in a bow of linguistic ignorance. They would be legally obligated to trace to the source and fix every problem, paying for the sins of the past. The cost wouldn't just be financial. The ensuing legal battles would take years, draining resources and creating a PR nightmare. Finch's reputation would be destroyed. The Atlas hospitality stock would plummet. It was a company-killing mistake. A question, sharp and terrifying, cut through her analysis. Have you seen a rule used like a weapon? In law school, they called it strategic ambiguity. Here, it was strategic incompetence. Atlas was so sure of their superiority, so dismissive of the details, that they had built their own gallows. They had handed their opponent a weapon and were smiling, oblivious as it was pointed right at their chest. And she, Imani Williams, janitor, was the only one who had seen it. The choice was crystallizing before her: comply with her role and let the company implode in silence, or resist, speak up, and risk whatever little she had. The makeshift solution with the junior translator proved disastrous. An argument had broken out, a complete misunderstanding over equity percentages. Mr. Chen, his patience finally exhausted, stood up. His voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable air of finality. "This is unproductive," he stated in crisp English, foregoing the translator entirely. "We are negotiating in bad faith. Shingley Innovations cannot proceed." He gave a slight, formal bow, and his delegation began gathering their things. The deal was dead. Alastair Finch's face went white, then a blotchy, furious red. The moment Mr. Chen was out of earshot, he exploded. "Thorne, what the hell just happened?" "You told me this was a lock." Thorne, desperate to deflect, immediately turned on the nearest target. "The translations were a mess. Chloe, where is Jeffrey Vale? Why don't you have a backup?" This was Imani's moment, the small window she'd been waiting for. She saw Chloe begin to crumble and knew she had to intervene, however small. She approached the junior staffer, ostensibly to clear away a water pitcher. "It's not the interpreter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's Clause 14b. The Mandarin is wrong, tell them." She had miscalculated. In her attempt to be discreet, she had underestimated Thorne's paranoid, sweeping gaze. He saw the whisper. His eyes narrowed and he strode over, his presence a physical force of anger. "What did you say to her?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Imani met his gaze. There's an error in the contract. Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. An error, you mop the floors. You don't read multi-billion-dollar contracts. You are done, he turned to Chloe. You stay, he said, pointing a finger at Imani. Get out. Now. He snapped his fingers and two hotel security guards who had been standing by discreetly moved towards her. Miss Williams, you need to come with us, one of them said, his tone impersonal. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a wall boxing her in. They were escorting her, not as an employee whose shift had ended, but as a threat that needed to be neutralized. Heads turned. The remaining Atlas executives watched, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disdain. She was the janitor who had overstepped, the invisible woman who had tried to make herself seen and was now being publicly, humiliatingly erased. If that happened to you, what would you do? The question burned in her mind as she was walked down the grand hallway, past the art she polished, across the floors she kept pristine. They took her down a service elevator, the stark metal walls a cold contrast to the opulence above. They didn't take her to the staff locker room. They took her to the security office, a small, windowless room in the basement. Mr. Thorne's instructions were that you are to be removed from the executive floors for the remainder of your shift, the guard said. You're confined to the sub-level. A door closed, not on a cell, but on her dignity. She was isolated, silenced, and confined to the hotel's underbelly. The system had pushed back hard. She had tried to help, and her reward was to be treated like a criminal. Up on the 40th floor, a corporate empire was on fire, and the only person with an extinguisher had just been locked in the basement. She sat on a hard plastic chair, the folded contract in her pocket now feeling less like a key and more like a stone, dragging her down into the dark. The silence in the security office was absolute. For nearly an hour, Imani sat on the uncomfortable chair, the hum of a server racked the only sound. The initial sting of humiliation began to fade, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. They hadn't just dismissed her, they had tried to break her. They had used the full weight of the hotel's hierarchy to put her back in her place. But they had made a critical error. They had given her time to think. In the solitude of that sterile room, a plan began to form. It wasn't a complex strategy of corporate espionage. It was simpler, more direct. Her power wasn't in threats or leverage. Her power was in the truth. The evidence was still in her pocket. Her mind contained the expertise. The only missing piece was the platform. How could she get them to listen? Just then, a walkie-talkie on the security desk crackled to life. It was the frantic, high-pitched voice of Alistair Finch himself, unfiltered and raw. Don't give me excuses. The deal is collapsing because of a language barrier. In 2025, find anyone in this god-forsaken building who speaks fluent Mandarin and get them to the ballroom now. I don't care if it's a bellhop, a chef, or a goddamn window washer. Now. The transmission clicked off, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The security guard at the desk looked up, his expression one of pure bewilderment. The door to the office burst open. It was Chloe, her face pale and streaked with mascara, her professional composure completely gone. She was breathing heavily as if she had run a marathon. Imani, she gasped. They're losing everything. Mr. Finch is. He's desperate. He just asked, he said. I heard, Imani said, her voice steady. She stood up. The moment had arrived, the desperate summons. The call to adventure she never asked for. Chloe looked at her, hope warring with fear in her eyes. Can you? I mean what you said before about the error. Is it real? Can you fix this? Imani met her gaze. She could have said no. She could have let them burn. It would have been a just if bitter revenge. But her plan wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. The error is real, she said. Whether they will let me fix it is another question. She looked down at her uniform. The gray, functional fabric, the ID badge that declared her a janitor. It was a costume of subservience, and she would not wear it into that boardroom. Not again. With a calm, deliberate motion, she unbuttoned the gray overshirt. She shrugged it off, folded it neatly, and placed it on the chair. Underneath, she was wearing a simple, well-kept black short-sleeved blouse. It wasn't a power suit, but it wasn't a uniform. It was her own. She unclipped her janitorial ID and put it in her pocket next to the folded contract. She was no longer representing the janitorial staff. She was representing herself. Let's go, Imani said, her voice devoid of fear. She was no longer being escorted out. She was walking back in. She was about to enter the proving ground, and this time they would have no choice but to listen. Following Chloe, Imani walked back into the rarefied air of the 40th floor. The energy in the hallway was frantic. Executives paced, speaking in hushed, panicked tones into their phones. When they saw Imani, they stopped. Stares of disbelief and contempt followed her as she walked towards the celestial ballroom. Mark Thorne saw her and started to move, his face contorting in rage. "What the hell do you think you're?" Chloe stepped in front of him. "Mr. Finch's orders," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "He said to get anyone." Thorne was left sputtering as Imani pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The scene in the ballroom was one of corporate carnage. Papers were scattered. Alastair Finch stood, his tie loosened, his face ashen. The Shingley delegation was still there, but they were standing by the windows, their backs to the table, a clear sign of their disengagement. Every head turned as Imani entered. A confused silence fell over the room. "What is this?" Finch demanded, his voice hoarse. "Who is this?" "This is Imani Williams," Chloe said from the doorway. "She speaks Mandarin." Finch looked at Imani, at her simple black blouse and gray work slacks, and scoffed. "The janitor. This is your solution, Thorne. You bring me the janitor." Imani ignored them all. She walked with a calm, unhurried gait to the large whiteboard at the front of the room, the same one they used for presentations. She picked up a black dry erase marker. The cap made a soft squeak as she removed it. The sound seemed to echo in the silent room. "The problem was never the interpreter," Imani said, her voice clear and resonant, filling the space in a way no one expected. "The problem is Clause 14B of the contract." She wrote the clause number on the board. Then, in elegant practice strokes, she wrote out the two competing phrases side by side. First, in English, future liabilities. Then, in Mandarin, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Su Yuan Pei Chang. The members of the Shingley delegation turned from the window, their eyes wide with surprise. Imani turned to face the room. She looked first at the Atlas executives. "Your document promises to indemnify you from liabilities that may occur in the future," she explained, her tone that of a professor lecturing a class. "It's a shield." Then, she turned to Mr. Chen and his team, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath as she switched effortlessly into flawless, formal Mandarin. "However, the term you have in your version, Su Yuan Pei Chang, is not a shield. It is a legal obligation to trace every problem to its root and assume all responsibility, past and present. It is not a shield, it is a sponge, designed to absorb pre-existing debt." A collective gasp went through the Chinese delegation. Literal goosebumps when she spoke. Her explanation was not just linguistically perfect, it was legally and culturally precise. She wasn't just translating words, she was translating intent, philosophy, and consequence. She capped the marker and set it down. "The two clauses do not mean the same thing," she said, switching back to English. "In fact, they mean the opposite. By signing this document, you wouldn't be starting a partnership. You would be buying a multi-million-dollar liability." The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of a world being turned upside down. Alastair Finch stared at her, his jaw slack. Mark Thorne looked like he had seen a ghost. Mr. Chen stepped forward, his expression one of deep, undisguised astonishment. He walked right up to Imani, bypassing the CEO entirely, and studied her for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. "Your analysis is brilliant. You speak with the precision of a Beijing law professor," he said. He then gave a slight, formal bow from the waist. "Who are you?" Imani stood tall, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My name is Imani Williams," she said, "and I understand the contract." The power in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably reversed. The janitor they had thrown out of the room now owned it. The fallout from Imani's revelation was swift and brutal. Alastair Finch, for the first time in his professional life, was speechless. His legal team huddled together, frantically flipping through their copies of the contract, their faces a mask of horror and dawning comprehension. They hadn't just made a mistake, they had committed malpractice on a spectacular scale. The deal wasn't just salvaged, it was fundamentally reset. Mr. Chen, now armed with the knowledge of Atlas's near-fatal incompetence, held all the cards. But his focus wasn't on the deal anymore, it was on Amani. "This is unacceptable," Finch finally managed to say, his voice a low growl directed at his own team. He then turned to Amani, his expression a chaotic mix of gratitude and utter bewilderment. "Miss Williams, we owe you anything, a bonus, name a number, a promotion, head of, something. Whatever you want." The entire room waited for her answer. This was her moment of triumph, her chance for reward and retribution. She could have destroyed Mark Thorne. She could have demanded an executive title and a corner office. She could have asked for a sum of money that would ensure she never had to clean another floor for the rest of her life. Instead, she shook her head. A quiet, firm gesture. "I don't want a bonus, Mr. Finch." Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. "The problem here isn't that I needed a reward. The problem is that I was standing in this hallway all morning and no one ever thought to ask me what I knew. Your system is not designed to see people like me, and it almost cost you everything." She paused, letting the words sink in. This wasn't a negotiation for personal gain. It was a diagnosis of a systemic disease. How many other people work in this building with degrees you don't know about? How many speak languages you can't hear? How many have skills you've made invisible with a uniform and a name badge? She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for something far more radical, acknowledgement. She was demanding they see the institutional blindness that had led them to this cliff edge. Sometimes justice arrives without applause. It arrives as a quiet, irrefutable truth spoken in a room full of powerful men. "I don't want a new job," she concluded. "I want a new system. A system that finds the talent you already have, before a crisis forces you to. A system that asks people what they know, not just what their job title is." Her request hung in the air, a proposal so unexpected and so profoundly right that it left them stunned once again. She had been offered a personal victory, and she had turned it into a demand for collective respect. She wasn't just fixing a contract. She was proposing to fix the culture that had allowed it to break. The stakeholders, from Finch to Chen, were left to weigh not a financial settlement, but a moral one. Amani's proposal acted like a catalyst in the stunned boardroom. It was a board member from Atlas, an older woman named Eleanor Vance who had been silent for most of the day, who spoke first. "She's right," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Completely right. We spend millions on external consultants and headhunters to find talent, while we have an army of brilliant, overlooked people polishing our floors and serving our coffee. It's not just an oversight, it's an institutional failure." The idea, once spoken aloud, gained immediate traction. It was a way for Finch to save face, to reframe this colossal embarrassment as a learning opportunity, a moment of corporate epiphany. Mr. Chen, deeply impressed by Amani's integrity, voiced his support. "A company's greatest asset is its people," he said, looking directly at Amani. "All of them." What followed was a rapid, high-level brainstorming session, with Amani suddenly at the center of it. She wasn't an executive, but for that hour, she was the most important strategist in the room. They didn't just agree on a vague concept. They began to lay out the specifics of a concrete new policy. It would be called the Grand Meridian Hidden Talents Initiative. The policy had three core components. First, the creation of a voluntary, confidential internal database. All employees, from management down to hourly staff, could register any accredited skills, degrees, certifications, or language fluencies. The information would be firewalled from direct supervisors to prevent bias and only accessed by a dedicated HR talent scout. Second, the company would offer paid time for verification and continuing education, sponsoring employees to get new certifications or complete degrees. Third, they would establish a quarterly internal talent showcase, where employees could present projects or skills to an audience of company executives, creating a direct pathway for internal mobility. The policy was named. A budget was provisionally allocated. Eleanor Vance was assigned to oversee its implementation, and her first official act was to turn to Amani. "We will need a consultant to help us design this program from the ground up," she said. "Someone who understands the problem from personal experience. Miss Williams, we would be honored if you would accept the position." It wasn't a promotion born from guilt. It was a role created from necessity. A role she had earned not just with her skills but with her vision. The path forward was clear. The change was beginning. There would still be resistance. Men like Thorne wouldn't vanish overnight, but a door had been opened not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay in their place. Days later, the chaos had subsided. The revised contract was signed. The lawyers had retreated. The executives had flown back to their respective headquarters. For Imani, the world had tilted on its axis. She was no longer a janitor. She was a consultant, with a temporary office on the 35th floor and a series of meetings scheduled with Alina Vance and the HR department. But the transition was jarring. The silence of her new office felt different from the silence of the empty hallways she used to clean. It was the silence of expectation, not of invisibility. One afternoon, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Chloe. In her hands, she held 2 cups of tea from the high-end cafe in the lobby, the kind Imani used to watch executives buy, never imagining she would be the one receiving it. "I thought you might need this," Chloe said, placing one of the cups on Imani's new, uncluttered desk. "It's oolong, the good stuff." Imani smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "Thank you, Chloe." They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the frantic energy of the negotiation seeming a world away. "You know," Chloe said finally, looking into her cup, "I almost quit that day when Thorne was yelling at me. I was ready to just walk out." "I know," Imani said gently. "But then I saw you," Chloe continued, looking up. Her eyes were clear, the fear gone, replaced with a quiet admiration. "You were so calm, even when they were walking you out. You were the calmest person in the building. I kept thinking, what does she know that they don't?" Imani considered the question. "Maybe I just knew that their panic wasn't mine to own," she said. "It wasn't about the deal, was it?" Chloe asked. "When you came back, it was about something else." "It was about being heard," Imani replied. "Just once." Chloe nodded, understanding. "Thank you," she said, and the words were imbued with a depth of meaning that went far beyond the tea. "Not for saving the deal, for showing me how to be brave." The acknowledgement was a balm. It wasn't the CEO desperate gratitude or the board's strategic praise. It was a simple, human recognition of her character. It was a micro-closure, a quiet healing moment that had nothing to do with contracts or corporate policy. It was about the bond forged in a supply closet, the shared humanity between 2 women at opposite ends of a brutal hierarchy. In that quiet office, with a simple cup of tea, Imani began to reclaim not just her professional identity, but her sense of self. She was no longer just the sum of her hidden skills. She was the woman who had shown someone else how to be brave. Before the Xingli delegation departed for Shanghai, Mr. Chen requested a final, private meeting, not with Alastair Finch but with Imani. They met in one of the hotel's quiet library lounges, a room of dark wood, leather chairs, and the scent of old books. He had dismissed his entire entourage. It was just the 2 of them. He didn't begin with pleasantries or platitudes about the deal. Instead, he motioned to the chessboard set up on a low table between them. "Do you play?" he asked. "It's been a while," Imani admitted. "The best strategists often say that," he said with a small smile. He pushed a white pawn forward 2 spaces. "Your move." As they played a slow, thoughtful game, he began to talk. "When you stood before that whiteboard," he said, his eyes on the board, "I was not impressed because you saved the deal. My legal team had already identified the error. We were testing your team's diligence, a test they failed spectacularly." Imani felt a jolt of surprise. So he had known. This wasn't about luck, it was about character. "No," he continued, capturing one of her nights. "I was impressed by why you spoke. You did not do it for personal gain. You did not do it for revenge against the manager who insulted you. You did it to correct an error, to restore balance. It was an act of intellectual integrity. That is a rare commodity." He finally looked up from the board, his gaze direct and piercing. "In my country, we have a saying, the finest jade is carved with the simplest tools. You have a formidable mind, Miss Williams, a mind that has been wasted polishing floors." He reached into his jacket and produced a simple, elegant business card. "Xingli Innovations is launching a new global ethics and compliance division. We need people who understand law not just as a weapon, but as a system of order. People who see the flaws others miss." He placed the card on the table beside the chessboard. "This is not a job offer. Not yet. It is an invitation. If you ever desire a position where your mind is your primary credential and integrity is your core job description, call me." He then stood up, the game of chess unfinished. "Checkmate, I believe, will be yours in 3 moves," he said. He gave her another respectful bow and left the room. Imani sat for a long time, the business card a heavy, solid presence on the table. This was the recognition she hadn't even known she was seeking. It wasn't about money or status. It was an acknowledgement from one brilliant mind to another. It was a door opening not just to a new job, but to a world where she would never be invisible again. Months melted into a season. The Hidden Talents Initiative was no longer just an idea, it was a functioning, funded program. Imani, working alongside Alina Vance, had been instrumental in its design. They had built the database, drafted the communication, and planned the first showcase. Her temporary consultancy had become a permanent role, Director of Internal Talent Development. Her office now had a view. From the 35th floor, she could see the city spread out below, a tapestry of glass and steel. One afternoon, a box arrived from HR containing her new corporate materials. Inside were business cards, a crisp new security pass, and her official company ID. The new ID was sleek and professional, a recent smiling photo of her. Her name, Imani Williams in bold letters, and her new title directly beneath it. It felt solid, real. She opened her desk drawer and took out her old janitorial ID badge. She had kept it, though she wasn't entirely sure why. She placed the 2 badges side by side on her desk. The contrast was stark. The old badge with its low-res photo, its functional, blocky text, its scuffed plastic. It was a symbol of an identity that had been assigned to her, a label that was meant to contain and define her. For 2 years, that small rectangle had been a passport to invisibility, a constant reminder of her place. When people looked at it, they stopped seeing her. They saw only the word janitor. Now she looked at it and saw something entirely different. It no longer represented erasure. It represented potential. It was a symbol of the immense, untapped value that lay hidden in plain sight. It was a reminder that behind every uniform, every job title, every plastic badge, was a human being with a history, a mind and skills that no one had ever thought to ask about. The old badge was a relic of the past, but it was also the cornerstone of the future she was now building. It was the why behind her entire program. She picked it up, the worn plastic warm in her hand. Its meaning had been transformed. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was a badge of honor, a quiet readiness for the future, born from a past that she had not just survived but transcended. A door had opened for others like her, and this small, scuffed piece of plastic was the key. The celestial ballroom was filled once again. But this time, there were no tense negotiations, no billion-dollar contracts on the line. The room was decorated for a celebration. It was the inaugural Hidden Talents Showcase. The audience was a mix of everyone from Alastair Finch and the board of directors to kitchen staff, maintenance workers, and housekeeping supervisors. The atmosphere was one of genuine excitement and curiosity. On stage, a man named Miguel, a maintenance engineer who worked the night shift, was demonstrating the mobile app he had coded in his spare time to streamline work order requests. He was a certified programmer, a skill no one at the Grand Meridian knew he possessed until he'd logged it in Imani's new database. The crowd applauded enthusiastically as he finished his presentation. Imani stood at the back of the room, watching. She wore a simple, elegant blue dress, not a suit, not a uniform. Chloe, who was now a junior project manager for the initiative, stood beside her, beaming. "Look at them," Chloe whispered. "They're not just employees anymore, they're people." Imani smiled. Her work here was more than just a program, it was a cultural shift. It was a slow, deliberate turning of a massive ship. Later, as guests mingled, Alastair Finch made his way through the crowd to Imani. He looked humbled, different from the arrogant man she had first encountered. "You were right, Imani," he said, his voice quiet. This is the smartest investment we've made all year." As the event wound down, Imani walked out into the grand hallway, the same one she used to mop. It was now filled with the sound of conversations between people who, just months ago, would never have spoken to one another. A chef was talking about his fluency in Farsi with a marketing director. A bellhop was discussing his graphic design portfolio with the head of branding. Near the entrance to the ballroom, mounted on the wall in a new, beautifully lit glass case, was a display dedicated to the founding of the new program. Inside the case, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single object. It was a Manny's old laminated janitorial ID badge. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "The greatest talent is the one we see every day but never notice. The Hidden Talents Initiative, founded 2025. A young woman, a new hire, paused in front of the case reading the plaque. She looked at the badge, then around at the vibrant, changed atmosphere of the hotel. A quiet sense of hope settled over the room. Imani watched for a moment, unseen at the far end of the hall. She didn't need the applause or the public credit. The legacy was there, enshrined in glass, a permanent reminder. The room had changed. The stillness was no longer one of sterile emptiness, but of profound, dignified potential. What quiet excellence did you learn from, and never thank? The question lingered in the air as she turned and walked away, her reflection gleaming in the flawless marble floor, no longer a ghost but a founder.